Hey guys, hope you're enjoying this. The next story we're going to read from Aesop's Fables is called The Wolf and the Ass. An ass was feeding on a pasture near a wood when he saw a wolf lurking in the shadows along the hedge. He easily guessed what the wolf had in mind and thought of a plan to save himself, so he pretended he was lame and began to hobble painfully. When the wolf came up, he asked the ass what had made him lame, and the ass replied that he had stepped on a sharp thorn. "Please pull it out," he pleaded, groaning as if in pain. "If you do not, it might stick in your throat when you eat me." The wolf saw the wisdom of the advice, for he wanted to enjoy his meal without any danger of choking. So the ass lifted up his foot, and the wolf began to search very closely and carefully for the thorn. Just then the ass kicked out with all his might, tumbling the wolf a dozen paces away, and while the wolf was getting up very slowly and painfully to his feet, the ass galloped away in safety. "Serves me right," growled the wolf as he crept into the bushes. "I'm a butcher by trade, not a doctor." The moral of this story is stick to your trade. The next story is called The Monkey and the Cat. Once upon a time, a cat and a monkey lived as pets in the same house. They were great friends, and they were constantly in all sorts of mischief together. What they seemed to think of more than anything else was getting something to eat, and it did not matter much to them how they got it. One day they were sitting by the fire, watching some chestnuts roasting on the hearth. How to get them was the question. "I would gladly get them," said the cunning monkey, "but you are much more skillful at such things than I am. Pull them out, and I'll divide them between us." Pussy stretched out her paw very carefully, pushed aside some of the cinders, and drew back her paw very quickly. Then she tried it again, this time pulling a chestnut half out of the fire. A third time, and she drew out the chestnut. This performance she went through several times, each time singeing her paw severely. As fast as she pulled the chestnuts out of the fire, the monkey ate them up. Now the master came in, and away scampered the rascals. Mistress Cat with a burnt paw and no chestnuts. From that time on, they say, she contented herself with mice and rats and had little to do with Sir Monkey. The moral of this story is, the flatterer seeks some benefit at your expense. Here's a really short one called The Dogs and the Fox. Some dogs found the skin of a lion and furiously began to tear it with their teeth. Fox chanced to see them and laughed scornfully. "If that lion had been alive," he said, "it would have been a very different story. He would have made you feel how much sharper his claws are than your teeth." The moral of this story is, it's easy and also contemptible to kick a man that is down. The Dogs and the Hides. Some hungry dogs saw a number of hides at the bottom of a stream where the tanner had put them to soak. A fine hide makes an excellent meal for a hungry dog, but the water was deep and the dogs could not reach the hides from the bank, so they held a council and decided that the very best thing to do was drink up all the river. All fell to lapping up the water as fast as they could, but though they drank and drank until one after another all of them had burst with drinking, still for all their effort the water in the river remained as high as ever. The moral of this story is, do not try to do impossible things. The Rabbit, the Weasel, and the Cat. A rabbit left his home one day for a dinner of clover, but he forgot to latch the door of his house, and while he was gone a weasel walked in and calmly made himself at home. When the rabbit returned, there was Weasel's nose sticking out of Rabbit's own doorway, sniffing the fine air. The rabbit was quite angry, for a rabbit, and requested the weasel to move out, but the weasel was perfectly content. He was settled down for good. A wise old cat heard the dispute and offered to settle it. "Come close to me," said the cat. "I am very deaf. Put your mouths close to my ears while you tell me the facts." The unsuspecting pair did as they were told, and in an instant the cat had both under her claws. No one could deny that the dispute had been definitely settled. The moral of the story is the strong are apt to settle questions to their own advantage. The Bear and the Bees. A bear roaming the woods in search of berries happened on a fallen tree in which a swarm of bees had stored their honey. The bear began to nose around the log very carefully to come find out if the bees were at home. Just then, one of the swarm came home from the clover field with a load of sweets. Guessing what the bear was after, the bee flew at him, stung him sharply, and then disappeared into the hollow log. The bear lost his temper in an instant and sprang upon the log, tooth and claw, to destroy the nest. But this only brought out the whole swarm. The poor bear had to take to his heels and was able to save himself only by diving into a pool of water. The moral of the story is, it's wiser to bear a single injury in silence than to provoke 1,000 by flying into a rage. The Fox and the Leopard. A fox and a leopard, resting lazily after a generous dinner, amused themselves by disputing about their good looks. The leopard was very proud of his glossy spotted coat and made disdainful remarks about the fox, whose appearance he declared was quite ordinary. The fox prided himself on his fine bushy tail with its tip of white, but he was wise enough to see that he could not rival the leopard in looks. Still, he kept up a flow of sarcastic talk just to exercise his wits and to have the fun of disputing. The leopard was about to lose his temper when the fox got up, yawning lazily. "You may have a very smart coat," he said, "but you would be a great deal better off if you had more smartness inside your head and less on your ribs, the way I am. That's what I call real beauty." The moral is, a fine coat is not always an indication of an attractive mind. This next story is called The Heron. The heron was walking sedately through the banks of a stream, his eyes on the clear water, and his long neck and pointed bill ready to snap up a likely morsel for his breakfast. The clear water swarmed with fish, but Master Heron was hard to please that morning. "No small fry for me," he said. "Such scanty fare is not fit for a heron." Now a fine young perch swam near. "No, indeed," said the heron. "I wouldn't even trouble to open my beak for anything like that." As the sun rose, the fish left the shallow water near the shore and swam below to the cool depths toward the middle. The heron saw no more fish, and very glad was he at last to breakfast on a tiny snail. The moral is, do not be too hard to suit, or you may have to be content with the worst or with nothing at all. The Cock and the Fox. One bright evening, as the sun was sinking on a glorious world, a wise old cock flew to a tree to roost. Before he composed himself to rest, he flapped his wings 3 times and crowed loudly. But just as he was about to put his head under his wing, his beady eyes caught a flash of red and a glimpse of a long pointed nose, and there just below him stood Master Fox. "Have you heard the wonderful news?" cried the fox in a very joyful and excited manner. "What news?" asked the cock very calmly. But he had a queer fluttery feeling inside him, for, you know, he was very much afraid of the fox. "Your family and mine and all other animals had agreed to forget their differences and live in peace and friendship from now on forever. Just think of it! I simply cannot wait to embrace you. Do come down, dear friend, and let us celebrate the joyful event." "How grand!" said the cock. "I certainly am delighted at the news," but he spoke in an absent way, and stretching up on his tiptoes seemed to be looking at something far off. "What is it you see?" asked the fox a little anxiously. "Why, it looks to me like a couple of dogs coming this way. They must have heard the good news and—" But the fox did not wait to hear more. Off he started on a run. "Wait!" cried the cock. "Why do you run? The dogs are friends of yours now." "Yes," answered the fox, "but they might not have heard the news. Besides, I have a very important errand that I almost forgotten about." The cock smiled as he buried his head in his feathers, and went to sleep, for he had succeeded in outwitting a very crafty enemy. The moral: the trickster is easily tricked. The dog in the manger. A dog asleep in a manger filled with hay was awakened by the cattle which came in tired and hungry from working in the field. But the dog would not let them get near the manger, and snarled and snapped as if it were filled with the best of meat and bones, all for himself. The cattle looked at the dog in disgust. "How selfish he is," said one. "He cannot eat the hay, and yet he will not let us eat it, who are so hungry for it." Now the farmer came in. When he saw how the dog was acting, he seized a stick and drove him out of the stable with many a blow for his selfish behavior. The moral being: do not grudge others what you cannot enjoy yourself. The wolf and the goat. A hungry wolf spied a goat browsing at the top of a steep cliff where he could not possibly get at her. "That is a very dangerous place for you," he called out, pretending to be very anxious about the goat's safety. "What if you should fall? Please listen to me and come down. Here you can get all you want of the finest, tenderest grass in the country." The goat looked over the edge of the cliff. "How very, very anxious you are about me," she said, "and how generous you are with your grass. But I know you. It's your own appetite you are thinking of, not mine." The moral is: an invitation prompted by selfishness is not to be accepted. The ass and the grasshoppers. One day, as an ass was walking in the pasture, he found some grasshoppers chirping merrily in a grassy corner of the field. He listened with a great deal of admiration to the song of the grasshoppers. It was such a joyful song that his pleasure-loving heart was filled with a wish to sing as they did. "What is it," he asked very respectfully, "that has given you such beautiful voices? Is there any special food you eat? Or is it some divine nectar that makes you sing so wonderfully?" "Yes," said the grasshoppers, who were very fond of a joke. "It is the dew we drink. Try some and see." So thereafter the ass would eat nothing and drink nothing but dew. Naturally, the poor foolish ass soon died. The moral is: the laws of nature are unchangeable. The mule. A mule had a long rest and much good feeding. He was feeling very vigorous indeed, and pranced around loftily, holding his head high. "My father certainly was a full-blooded racer," he said. "I can feel that distinctly." The next day he was put into a harness again, and that evening he was very downhearted indeed. "I was mistaken," he said. "My father was an ass after all." The moral is: be sure of your pedigree before you boast of it. The fox and the goat. A fox fell into a well, and though it was not very deep, he found that he could not get out again. After he had been in the well a long time, a thirsty goat came by. The goat thought the fox had gone down to drink, so he asked if the water was good. "The finest in the whole country," said the crafty fox. "Jump in and try it. There is more than enough for both of us." The thirsty goat immediately jumped in and began to drink. The fox just as quickly jumped on the goat's back and leaped from the tip of the goat's horns out of the well. The foolish goat now saw what a plight he had gotten into, and begged the fox to help him out, but the fox was already on his way to the woods. If you had as much sense as you have beard, old fellow," he said as he ran, "you would have been more cautious about finding a way to get out again before you jumped in." The moral being: look before you leap. The cat, the cock, and the young mouse. A very young mouse, who had never seen anything of the world, almost came to grief the very first time he ventured out, and this is the story he told his mother about his adventures. "I was strolling along very peaceably when, just as I turned the corner into the next yard, I saw two strange creatures. One of them had a very kind and gracious look, but the other was most fearful, the most fearful monster you can imagine. You should have seen him. On top of his head and in front of his neck hung pieces of raw meat. He walked about restlessly, tearing up the ground with his toes and beating his arms savagely against his side. The moment he caught sight of me, he opened his pointed mouth as if to swallow me, and then he let out a piercing roar that frightened me almost to death. Can you guess who it was our young mouse was trying to describe to his mother? It was nobody but the barnyard cock, and the first one the little mouse had ever seen. If it had not been for that terrible monster, the mouse went on, I would have made the acquaintance of the pretty creature, who looked so good and gentle. He had thick, velvety fur, a meek face, and a look that was very modest, though his eyes were bright and shiny. As he looked at me, he waved his fine, long tail and smiled. I am sure he was just about to speak to me when the monster I have told you about let out a screaming yell, and I ran for my life. My son, said Mother Mouse, that gentle creature you saw was none other than the cat. Under his kindly appearance, he bears a grudge against every one of us. The other was nothing but a bird who wouldn't harm you at the least. As for the cat, he eats us, so be thankful, my child, that you escaped with your life, and as long as you live, never judge people by their looks. The moral of this story is do not trust alone to outward appearances. The Wolf and the Shepherd. A wolf had been prowling around a flock of sheep for a long time, and the shepherd watched very anxiously to prevent him from carrying off a lamb. But the wolf did not try to do any harm. Instead, he seemed to be helping the shepherd take care of the sheep. At last the shepherd got so used to seeing the wolf about that he forgot how wicked he could be. One day he even went so far as to leave his flock in the wolf's care while he went on an errand. But when he came back and saw how many of the flock had been killed and carried off, he knew how foolish it was to trust a wolf. The moral is, once a wolf, always a wolf. The Peacock and the Crane. A peacock, puffed up with vanity, met a crane one day, and to impress him, spread his gorgeous tail in the sun. Look, he said, what have you to compare with this? I am dressed in all the glory of the rainbow, while your feathers are gray as dust. The crane spread his broad wings and flew up towards the sun. Follow me if you can, he said, but the peacock stood where he was among the birds of the barnyard, while the crane soared in freedom far up into the blue sky. The moral: the useful is of much more importance and value than the ornamental. The Farmer and the Cranes. Some cranes saw a farmer plowing a large field. When the work of plowing was done, they patiently watched him sow the seed. It was their feast, they thought. So as soon as the farmer had finished planting and gone home, down they flew to the field, and they began to eat as fast as they could. The farmer, of course, knew the cranes and their ways. He had experience with such birds before. He soon returned to the field with a sling, but he did not bring any stones with him. He expected to scare the cranes just by swinging the sling in the air and shouting loudly at them. At first the cranes flew away in great terror, but they soon began to see that none of them ever got hurt. They did not even hear the noise of stones whizzing through the air, and as for words, they would kill nobody. At last they paid no attention whatever to the farmer. The farmer saw that he would have to take other measures. He wanted to save at least some of his grain, so he loaded his sling with stones and killed several of the cranes. This had the effect the farmer wanted, for from that day the cranes visited his field no more. The moral of this story is bluff and threatening words are of little value with rascals. Bluff is no proof that hard fists are lacking. The Farmer and His Sons. A rich old farmer who felt that he had not many more days to live called his sons to his bedside. My sons, he said, heed what I have to say to you. Do not on any account part with the estate that has belonged to our family for so many generations. Somewhere on it is hidden a rich treasure. I do not know the exact spot, but it is there, and you will surely find it. Spare no energy and leave no spot unturned in your search. The father died, and no sooner was he in his grave than the sons set to work digging with all their might, turning up every foot of ground with their spades and going over the whole farm 2 or 3 times. No hidden gold did they find, but at harvest time they had settled their accounts and had pocketed a rich profit far greater than any of their neighbors. They understood that the treasure their father had told them about was the wealth of a bountiful crop, and that in their industry they had found the treasure. The moral being, industry is itself a treasure. The 2 pots. 2 pots, one of brass and the other of clay, stood together on the hearthstone. One day the brass pot proposed to the earthen pot that they go out into the world together. But the earthen pot excused himself, saying it would be wiser for him to stay in the corner by the fire. "It would take so little to break me," he said. "You know how fragile I am. The least shock is sure to shatter me." "Don't let that keep you at home," urged the brass pot. "I shall take very good care of you. If we should happen to meet anything hard, I will step between and save you." So the earthen pot at last consented, and the 2 set out side by side, jolting along on 3 stubby legs, first to this side, then to that, and bumping into each other at every step. The earthen pot could not survive that sort of companionship very long. They had not gone 10 paces before the earthen pot cracked, and at the next jolt he flew into 1,000 pieces. The moral being, equals make the best friends. The Goose and the Golden Egg. There was once a countryman who possessed the most wonderful goose you can imagine, for every day when he visited the nest, the goose had laid a beautiful, glittering golden egg. The countryman took the eggs to market and soon began to get rich, but it was not long before he grew impatient with the goose because she gave him only a single golden egg a day. He was not getting rich fast enough. Then one day, after he had finished counting his money, the idea came to him that he could get all the golden eggs at once by killing the goose and cutting it open. But when the deed was done, not a single golden egg did he find, and his precious goose was dead. The moral being, those who have plenty want more, and so lose all they have. The Fighting Bulls and the Frog. 2 bulls were fighting furiously in a field, at one side of which was a marsh. An old frog living in the marsh trembled as he watched the fierce battle. "What are you afraid of?" asked the young frog. "Do you not see," replied the old frog, "that the bull who is beaten will be driven away from the good forage up there to the reeds of this marsh, and we shall all be trampled into the mud?" It turned out as the frog had said. The beaten bull was driven into the marsh, where his great hooves crushed the frogs to death. The moral being, when the great fall out, the weak must suffer for it. The Mouse and the Weasel. A little hungry mouse found his way one day into a basket of corn. He had to squeeze himself a good deal to get through the narrow opening between the strips of the basket, but the corn was tempting and the mouse was determined to get in. When at last he succeeded, he gorged himself to bursting. Indeed, he had become about 3 times as big around the middle as he was when he went in. At last he felt satisfied and dragged himself to the opening to get out again, but the best he could do was get his head out. So there he sat, groaning and moaning, both from the discomfort inside him and the anxiety to escape from the basket. Just then a weasel came by. He understood the situation quickly. "My friend," he said, "I know what you've been doing. You've been stuffing. That's what you get. You will have to stay there until you feel just like you did when you went in. Good night, and good enough for you." And that was all the sympathy the poor mouse got. The moral being, greediness leads to misfortune. The Farmer and the Snake. A farmer walked through his field one cold morning. On the ground lay a snake, stiff and frozen with the cold. The farmer knew how deadly the snake could be, and yet he picked it up and put it in his bosom to warm it back to life. The snake soon revived, and when it had enough strength, bit the man who had been so kind to it. The bite was deadly, and the farmer felt that he must die. As he drew his last breath, he said to those standing around, and this is also the moral, learn from my fate and not to take pity on a scoundrel. The Sick Stag. A stag had fallen sick. He had just enough strength to gather some food and find a quiet clearing in the woods, where he lay down to wait until his strength would return. The animals heard about the stag's illness and came to ask after his health. Of course, they were all hungry and helped themselves freely to the stag's food. And as you would expect, the stag soon starved to death. The moral being, goodwill is worth nothing unless it is accompanied by good acts.